Welcome to MetroFocus. I'm Jack Ford. As the coronavirus pandemic has continued its rampage across the globe, there is new and very troubling evidence that it is bringing along with it an increase in anti-Semitism. So, why is that happening? How is that happening? And as important, what can we do about it? Well, to talk about those issues, we're pleased to be joined once again by Jonathan Greenblatt, who's the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League. Jonathan, welcome to you, and thank you for joining us.
Nice to be back, Jack, and good to see you.
So I mentioned that troubling evidence that, of course, you have seen and been grappling with.
Yes.
To frame our conversation here, can you give us a sense of context? What is it about what we're experiencing now that is similar to what we've seen in the past, in history, circumstances that have also given rise to increases in anti-Semitism?
Well, Jack, it's a good question, and it's interesting. I mean, we are struggling with this sort of pandemic, which feels like a once-in-a-century challenge. But in reality, it's revealing sort of timeless trends of prejudice and hate. So, in particular, at the ADL, we've been fighting anti-Semitism and all forms of bigotry for more than 100 years. And we've been particularly struck by how, since the earliest reports of the virus, as it came out of East Asia and China specifically, there have been stories circulating online and offline, blaming the Jewish people, or sometimes even the Jewish state, for either creating the virus, or uniquely spreading the virus, or even reports that Jews are trying to profit from the virus. Now, again, this seems odd to the casual observer, because clearly this has nothing to do with being Jewish. But in fact, for centuries, one of the most persistent tropes of anti-Semitism, one of the most typical ways that different aggrieved groups have tried to blame the Jews on problems, is what we know as the blood libel. The accusation that Jews are somehow responsible for conspiring to kill non-Jews. And sometimes in the medieval period, they were blamed for, quote, poisoning wells. And then they were blamed for the bubonic plague, a pandemic of an earlier time that didn't spread in the Jewish community as it did in other communities, in large part because the Jews were forced to live in ghettos, apart from where the virus was spreading. In part because the Jews used the kosher laws for their food and had a degree of hygiene that, again, wasn't typical in the mainstream population. So Jews were blamed for this disease because it didn't consume them at the same rate that it did majoritarian communities. But so as it has been where Jews have been blamed for, again, the bubonic plague, now we see them being blamed for the plague of COVID-19, and it's quite shocking.
There are some very distinct parallels here, as you mentioned. Also, the actions of extremist groups now, yes, indeed, compared to the action of extremist groups in the past. But we also have some high-tech additions, if you will, to instances of anti-Semitism. Talk a little bit about that. Things such as zoombombing.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting, Jack. One of the things we've seen is how extremists have exploited, as they often do, this crisis to kind of push their hate. And they've also been very adaptive and innovated using new technologies and platforms. At ADL, we've long been watching how they moved from early bulletin board systems and AOL accounts to the internet, to Facebook and Twitter. And now, as you said, they've been very intentional about exploiting Zoom, this very popular platform for video conferencing. Early on, some trolls and hackers revealed how you could fairly easily try to break into, or quote unquote Zoom bomb, people's meetings. Again, with a little bit of code, you could identify meetings as they were taking place and literally insert yourself into the meeting. We saw that happen again and again. And again, at first it was just trolls doing pranks, but soon it became white supremacists pushing pornography, racism, anti-Semitic imagery and language. And they targeted, for example, a State Department meeting with Jewish students in Massachusetts. They targeted a speech by the president of Yeshiva University to the campus. They've targeted religious services. I know one venture capitalist in Silicon Valley who had his Torah study on a Sunday morning Zoom bombed by neo-Nazis. And so what we've done at ADL in response to this, we set up a center in Silicon Valley back in 2017, Jack, and we've talked about it before, because we believe that Facebook is the front line in fighting hate. Well, through our center in Silicon Valley, we reached out to the senior executive team at Zoom. And I was soon on emails and in direct communication with the CEO and their CTO and their chief product officer, who took our very specific guidance on how to improve the product. And we were able to do that, Jack, because the guy who runs our center is himself a software engineer. And in the end, Zoom made many of the changes we recommended and took our advice to push it out before Easter and Passover, when so many of us would be doing religious services or seders and family dinners over Zoom. So many of the issues with Zoom have been resolved because of their new safety features. And I'm glad ADL was able to play just a small role in making that happen.
Yeah. Let me preface the next couple of questions by underscoring the fact that the vast majority of all religious groups are following the restrictions, the social distancing, all of the rules and regulations that have been established to provide for the safety and well-being of all of us, right? Prefacing it with that. And you've said this before. I've seen you say this. So, understanding that, what would you say to somebody who came up to you and said, look, you're the head of the ADL, and I've got to tell you, I am clearly not anti-Semitic, but I am also clearly troubled by some of the images I've seen of Jewish communities gathering, literally in defiance of these orders. And this person says to you, you know what it makes me feel like? It makes me feel like these groups are saying, we don't care about you. We care only about ourselves and our own rituals and rules, and we're going to continue to flout the rules and regulations, again, because we don't care and we don't want to be part of your communities and follow your rules, right?
Yeah.
What would you say to that person?
Look, I would say I sympathize with your position and I share your frustration, and I might even say anger. I think whether it's Orthodox Jews, and there have been some reports and evidence that in some communities there have been members of the Orthodox community who have indeed, as you've said, congregated in defiance of the edicts of mayors or governors or just broader public sentiment in order to observe their rituals, in order to pray or daven, in order to come together for celebrations. And that's flat out wrong. Now, the fact of the matter is the vast majority aren't doing that. Just like there have been some examples of evangelical, leaders. Jerry Falwell Jr. at Liberty University, who said, we're going to reconvene our campus in defiance of the order from Governor Northam in Virginia. But the vast majority of evangelical leaders have also been abiding by the guidelines. I think it's critical that we, number one, don't take the exception as the rule. Don't stereotype an entire community because of the actions of a few or a small number. But then number two, we do need to hold every community to these standards. And again, I don't think that the restrictions of social distancing and the closure of houses of worship have been done to target the Jews or any denomination of the Jewish people, nor evangelicals or any branch of Christianity, nor mosques or any branch of the Muslim community. I could go on. But I think all of us have an obligation to one another to observe by these guidelines, at least until elected officials and public health experts can give us better guidance on what it's going to take to beat this crisis. Because no matter how you pray, no matter your degree of observance, we've seen that this COVID-19 tears through communities and ultimately impacts us all. So we've got to take it very seriously.
What would you say to various faith leaders, right? Not just leaders of the Jewish community, the Jewish faith, but we mentioned the evangelicals, some other Christian organizations who are defying these standards and these restrictions. What would you say to the faith leaders in terms of what they need to do to get out there and to make sure that this isn't happening? Because as you know, just these images of members of the Jewish community fuels the flames of anti-Semitism, despite the fact that, as you said, it is the vast minority that are doing that. So what should be the role of the faith leaders to help this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I'm glad you asked it, because I do think in moments like this, when there is so much anxiety, when there is so much uncertainty, when so many of us are afraid of the daily rituals that we once employed, like, I don't know, a few weeks ago, right? The routines that we considered normal, and now suddenly everything has become dangerous and everything has become kind of off limits. And so people are afraid. So they are right now looking to those religious leaders for guidance. So I would say, whether you're a rabbi or the head of a Jewish federation or the president of a synagogue community, whether you're Orthodox or Reform or conservative or Reconstructionist, whether you're secular, and again, whether you're evangelical or Catholic or any other, segment of the Protestant faith or an Orthodox Christian community, an imam or a guru, I think all of us have an obligation to say to those who listen to us, to speak to our, congregants and our community members, to say, stop. This is that rare moment where our faith commands us, because we care about each other, because we all believe in the adage of the golden rule of doing unto others. We've got to stay home. We've got to hold ourselves together and protect one another by literally socially distancing, at least for the time being. And if you don't do that, you're putting not only yourself at risk, you're jeopardizing your whole community. And I think we've all got to be just a little bit more responsible than that. So I do hope faith leaders, and I've heard some of it. I was struck by Rick Warren, the very well-known pastor out in Southern California, who talked to his flock and his followers just about this, about staying home. I think about my old rabbi, David Wolpe, at a large synagogue in Los Angeles, who said the same thing to his followers for his Passover message. He said, don't come to synagogue. I mean, what a moment when this is the message that our faith leaders are sending, but that's exactly what I think the public and these communities need to hear.
Well, I think you're right. There are important messages out there. Some are communicating those messages. I think the message from what you said here in this conversation is very helpful to all of us. Jonathan Greenblatt, once again, the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League. Jonathan, it's always helpful when we get a chance to talk with you. I look forward to having the chance to talk again, but this time back in our studios once.
I really look forward to it.
All right. Jonathan, you stay safe and you be well, and thanks so much for spending some time with us.
Thank you.